The gymnasium of Nuremberg prison was cold, dimly lit, and utterly silent, except for the echo of boots on a stone floor. A man walked through the door. He was 46 years old. He had once ruled an entire country with unlimited power. He had ordered the deaths of millions. He had feasted on the finest food in occupied Europe while the people beneath him starved. He had signed documents that erased entire communities from the face of the earth, and he had filed them neatly in 43 volumes of a personal diary, as if managing a business ledger. Now he walked toward a wooden gallows inside a bombed-out gym. And he was smiling. His name was Hans Frank, and in the hours that followed, the man once called the Butcher of Poland would face the only verdict that history ever owed him. This is the story of how a lawyer became a mass murderer and how justice, slow and imperfect as it was, finally caught up with him. To understand how Hans Frank ended up on that gallows, you have to go back to the beginning, to the man he was before the war, before Poland, before the blood. Hans Michael Frank was born on May 23, 1900 in Karlsruhe in what was then the German Empire. His father was a lawyer, a respectable profession, a respectable household. But respectability would not define the son. At the age of 17, Frank joined the German army to fight in the First World War. When that war ended in defeat and humiliation for Germany, he found himself drawn, like so many young, angry, disillusioned veterans, toward the radical fringe of German politics. He joined the Freikorps, the brutal paramilitary units that prowled the streets of post-war Germany, engaging in street brawls, intimidation, and political murders. These groups would later be absorbed into the SS when the Nazis came to power, and Frank was already moving in their circles. In 1921, Frank joined what was then called the German Workers' Party, the organization that would soon be renamed the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the Nazi Party. He was one of its earliest members. 2 years later, in November 1923, he participated in the Beer Hall Putsch, Adolf Hitler's failed attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government in Munich. The coup collapsed, Hitler was arrested, and Hans Frank, like the rest of the conspirators, went home and waited. But he did not sit idle. He went to university. He studied economics and jurisprudence, and in 1926 he passed the German state bar examination and became a practicing lawyer in Munich. What happened next would define the next 2 decades of his life. Hans Frank became Hitler's lawyer. Not in a casual sense, Frank threw himself into the legal work of the Nazi Party with extraordinary energy and ambition. He represented the party in hundreds of court cases during the turbulent Weimar years, defending Hitler and senior Nazi officials against charges of sedition, treason, and political violence. He became so indispensable to the movement that by 1929, Hitler had made him the head of the Nazi Party's legal office. By 1930, he was elected to the Reichstag, the German parliament. He was a rising star. One case in particular cemented his fame inside the Nazi movement. In 1930, Frank served as defense counsel for 3 Reichswehr army officers who had been charged by the German government for secretly supporting the Nazi Party. The trial was sensational. Hitler himself took the stand to testify, railing against the German leadership in front of the press. Frank built a defense that generated enormous sympathy for the Nazi cause and enormous contempt for the government that had brought the charges. Germany watched and many were moved. Frank's star was rising fast. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, rewards came quickly. Frank was appointed Minister of Justice for Bavaria, the President of the Academy of German Law, and eventually Reich Minister without portfolio. He accumulated titles, he accumulated offices, he accumulated the trappings of power. But he did not accumulate real influence. Despite all those titles, Frank never truly belonged to Hitler's inner circle. Part of this was professional. Hitler famously despised lawyers. He saw them as men who split hairs and complicated things that should be simple. Part of it was personal. Frank came from a middle-class background, and Hitler had contempt for what he considered bourgeois sensibilities. Frank even had the audacity in 1934 to object when Hitler moved against Ernst Röhm and the SA leadership in the Night of the Long Knives, the bloody purge in which Nazi leaders were murdered without trial, without due process, without law. Frank's objection was not moral, it was procedural. He was bothered by the extrajudicial nature of the killings, by the fact that the law had been ignored. This was the central contradiction of Hans Frank's career. A man who believed in the form of the law, who wanted courts and processes and documentation, while serving a regime that was systematically building the machinery of mass murder. His superiors noted his objections, his titles remained, his influence shrank. For a man of Frank's ambition, Poland would seem like his great salvation. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, the country was crushed, and on October 26, 1939, Hans Frank was appointed Governor-General of the occupied Polish territories, the man in absolute control of everything that had not been directly annexed into Germany itself, an area of roughly 90,000 square kilometers, a population of millions. He moved his headquarters to Krakow, to the ancient royal castle of Wall where Polish kings had once ruled. He dressed in military-style uniforms, he threw parties, he had his wife brought to live with him in a palace looted from its Polish owners. The locals called her the Queen of Poland. To Frank, this was the summit of everything he had worked for. He had his own territory, his own kingdom. He had absolute power, and he used it without mercy. From the very first days of his administration, Frank made the purpose of German rule in Poland brutally clear. Poland was not to be governed, it was to be exploited. It was to be stripped of everything of value, its agricultural output, its industrial capacity, its human beings, and fed into the German war machine. He ordered the confiscation of Polish property on a massive scale: farms, businesses, homes, artworks, savings, all of it subject to seizure by the German administration. Polish universities were closed on direct orders from Hitler. Polish culture was to be erased. Frank himself said it plainly: Poland was to exist only as a labor source for the Reich. And a labor source it became. More than 1 million Polish civilians were deported to Germany as forced laborers. They were taken from their homes, loaded onto trains, and shipped west to work in German factories and farms under conditions that amounted to slavery. Many would never return. For those who remained, life under Frank's general government was a state of organized terror. Food rationing meant that Poles received drastically lower caloric allocations than German residents. Starvation was not an accident, it was policy. Frank played a major role in the economic exploitation that led to the deaths of countless Poles through hunger and disease. Any sign of resistance was met with collective punishment. Mass executions were carried out in public. Hundreds of villages were demolished and their inhabitants massacred when the German forces suspected partisan activity. Public hangings in city squares remained a regular feature of daily life under Frank's rule, from 1939 until the very last days of the German occupation. Frank's own words, recorded in his meticulous personal diary, capture the scale of his ambitions and his contempt for the people under his control. In December 1941, at a cabinet session of his own general government, he spoke openly about what he saw as the Jewish question. "We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them." He did not flinch from saying it plainly. He said it in a room full of officials, and he had it written down. Frank oversaw the herding of Poland's Jewish population, the largest Jewish community in Europe, into ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto alone held over 400,000 people in conditions of deliberate deprivation. Frank issued a decree requiring all Jews over the age of 10 to wear Star of David armbands. He issued the ordinance that made it punishable by death not just for Jews, but for any Pole, to provide shelter or assistance to a Jewish person in hiding. Under the authority of the general government, Frank's authority, the extermination camps of Bel-Stroksy, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Sobibokutar operated. These were not concentration camps. These were death factories, purpose-built for the industrial murder of human beings. An estimated 2 million Polish Jews were killed in camps that operated within Frank's administrative territory. Frank was not a passive bystander, he was the civilian ruler of the territory in which these camps existed. He attended conferences, he received reports, he issued orders, he knew. He knew everything. His 43 volumes of diaries made that undeniably clear. And yet Frank was not without conflict. Even as he presided over this reign of terror, he clashed repeatedly with HIMMLER SS over who controlled the police apparatus within the general government. Frank wanted authority. HIMMLER wanted control. HITLER usually sided with HIMMLER. In 1942, after Frank made a series of speeches in Berlin, Vienna, and Munich that were seen as politically inconvenient speeches in which he raised the idea of independent judicial authority, of rule by law rather than rule by terror, HITLER stripped him of his positions outside the general government and publicly humiliated him. Frank submitted resignation letters, 14 of them by some accounts. HITLER rejected everyone. He was trapped in his own kingdom, increasingly sidelined from real power, watching as the SS extended its grip over every corner of the territory he nominally ruled. In January 1945, as the Soviet Red Army poured across Poland's eastern borders and the dream of the Thousand-Year Reich began to collapse into rubble, Hans Frank fled. He abandoned his castle in Krakow. He abandoned his administration. He drove west into Germany, carrying whatever he could take with him, including, remarkably, all 43 volumes of his personal diary. He was captured by American troops on May 4, 1945 near Tegernsee in Bavaria. When soldiers found him, he had already attempted suicide, slashing his wrists and his throat. He survived. He was taken into custody. The war was over, the reckoning had begun. The International Military Tribunal convened at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, the same city where Hitler had once held his enormous Nazi rallies, beginning on November 20, 1945. 24 of the highest-ranking surviving officials of the Third Reich were indicted. They faced 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Hans Frank was among them. From the very start, Frank's trial had a quality unlike almost any other criminal proceeding in history. The prosecution did not need to build its case from witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. They had his own words, his own handwriting, his own diary, 43 volumes that Frank himself had voluntarily handed over to the American soldiers who arrested him. Think about that for a moment. A man who had ordered mass executions, who had overseen the starvation of millions, who had administered the territory in which 2 million Jews were murdered, handed his own written record of all of it to the people who would put him on trial. During the proceedings, Frank's defense was a study in contradiction. He insisted that he had not personally installed or operated extermination camps. He claimed he had been unaware of the full extent of the mass killings at concentration camps until early 1944. He argued that much of the criminal activity in the general government had been carried out by the SS and Gestapo without his knowledge, and sometimes over his objections. He attempted to place responsibility on Himmler for the worst of what happened. And yet in the same breath he admitted guilt. He acknowledged that the crimes of the Nazi regime were crimes. He said at his trial that 5 months of proceedings had given him a full insight into the horrible atrocities that had been committed, and that he was possessed by a deep sense of guilt. He said he had not destroyed his diaries and had handed them over voluntarily. He was, in many ways, the strangest defendant at Nuremberg. While men like Hermann defied the tribunal from the dock with contempt and cynicism, and others denied everything with robotic stubbornness, Frank wept. He converted to Roman Catholicism during the trial, reconnecting with a faith he had abandoned decades before. He read the Bible in his cell. Prison psychologist Dr. Gustave Gilbert, who interviewed the defendants throughout the proceedings, described Frank as sitting in his cell full of abject remorse, cursing Hitler with what Gilbert called amazing vehemence and literary facility. Frank told the tribunal that he had tried to resign 14 times, that he had objected to the lawlessness, that he had been a prisoner of Hitler quotas will as much as anyone. The tribunal was not moved to mercy by these arguments, and why would they be? His own diary said everything. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict on Hans Frank. Guilty on count 3, war crimes, guilty on count 4, crimes against humanity. The sentence, death by hanging. Frank received the sentence without visible collapse. He had been expecting it. He told those around him that he accepted it. He said that if he were sentenced to death, it would be justified. He had even written in a moment of reflective clarity during the trial that 1,000 years would pass and Germany's guilt would not be erased. He had 15 days to wait. Nuremberg prison. October 15, 1946, the night before the executions. In a cell not far from where Hans Frank sat reading his Bible, Hermann Göring, the most senior of all the condemned, the man who had been second only to Hitler himself, was doing something very different. Göring had been denied his request to be shot by firing squad rather than hanged, a form of execution he considered more befitting a soldier, so he had made other arrangements. At around 10:45 p.m. on the night before the scheduled executions, Göring bit down on a potassium cyanide capsule that had somehow been smuggled into his cell. He was dead within minutes. The most important prisoner of the entire Nuremberg proceedings had cheated the gallows. It was a scandal, and it meant that instead of 11 men being hanged the following morning, there would be 10. In the hours before the executions began, the condemned men were allowed visits from chaplains. They were given a meal. Frank met with a Catholic priest and received last rites. He was, by all accounts, at peace or performing peace with the polished composure of a lawyer who had spent his career managing how he appeared in public. Shortly after 1:00 a.m. on October 16, 1946, the first condemned man, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was led from his cell and walked to the gymnasium where 3 temporary wooden gallows had been erected. American Master Sergeant John C. Woods and his assistant, military policeman Joseph Malta, were the executioners. The witnesses included Allied military officers, journalists, and chaplains. Approximately 30 people in total in a cold gymnasium in the early hours of the morning. One by one, the condemned men were led in. Ribbentrop, Cadel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg. Then Hans Frank. He walked in at approximately 2:09 a.m., and witnesses noted immediately what was remarkable about him, something that separated him from every other man who had walked through that door that morning. He was smiling. Not the wild-eyed defiance of Julius Streicher, who would come after him and shout Heil Hitler from the gallows. Not the rigid military composure of Field Marshal Cadel. Not the trembling, barely controlled terror visible on so many of the others. Hans Frank walked into the execution chamber with a smile. Reporter Howard K. Smith, who was present as a witness, later wrote that Frank was the only one of the condemned men to enter the chamber with a smile on his face. Though he was nervous, observers noted him swallowing frequently. He projected, in Smith's words, the appearance of a man who had made his peace. He was asked to state his name. Hans Frank. He was given the opportunity to speak last words. And the man who had once ruled an entire occupied country with absolute power, who had signed the orders that sent millions to their deaths, who had feasted in a looted royal castle while the people beneath him starved, said this. I am thankful for the kind treatment during my imprisonment, and I ask God to accept me with mercy. The black hood was placed over his head, the noose was set around his neck. Sergeant Woods pulled the lever, the trapdoor opened. Hans Frank dropped. He was dead. It was 2:14 a.m. His body was photographed, as were all the bodies that night, for the official record. It was later reported by some accounts that the executions that morning were badly conducted, that the standard drop method used, rather than the long drop preferred by British executioners, meant that the rope length was not correctly calibrated to produce an immediate, clean death. Some of the condemned men reportedly died of slow strangulation rather than an instantly broken neck. Ribbentrop and others were said to have struggled on the rope for over 10 minutes. Whether Hans Frank suffered in his final moments, the record does not clearly tell us. What the record tells us is that at 2:14 a.m. on October 16, 1946, the man responsible for the administration of territory in which millions of human beings were murdered was dead. All 10 bodies were later cremated. The ashes of Hans Frank, along with those of the others executed that morning, were scattered into the Isar River near Munich. No grave, no marker, no place for the living to visit or to curse. Only the 43 volumes of his diary remained. What do we make of Hans Frank? He was not a simple monster. That would almost be easier to understand. Simple monsters are creatures of pure malice undiluted by contradiction. Hans Frank was something more disturbing, a highly educated, intellectually engaged, culturally sophisticated man who placed his considerable talents in service of mass murder and kept meticulous records of it. He read Goethe, he appreciated music, he had a wife, children, a family life. He had argued early in his career for the independence of the judiciary. He had written academic papers about law and justice. He had objected on procedural grounds to extrajudicial killings. He was the man who said in a moment of apparent clarity during the Nuremberg proceedings that 1,000 years would pass and Germany's guilt would not fade. And he was also the man who wrote in his own diary in his own words in 1941, "We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them." The question of whether Hans Frank truly repented, or whether he was performing repentance with the skill of a seasoned courtroom attorney, is one that historians and psychologists have never fully resolved. His conversion to Catholicism in prison, his tears, his expressions of guilt, were they genuine? Or were they, as some have suggested, the final performance of a man who understood that contrition was the only currency he had left? His son, Nicholas Frank, grew up to write a searing, unflinching book about his father, not a defense, not an excuse, but a condemnation. Nicholas Frank has spent decades speaking publicly about the crimes of his father, refusing to allow memory to soften into mythology. He visited his father in Nuremberg prison as a 7-year-old child. He was 8 when Hans Frank was executed. The Nuremberg trials themselves, of which Frank's execution was one outcome, represent something extraordinary in the history of human civilization. For the first time, the leaders of a state were held individually accountable, not as a collective abstraction but as specific human beings who had made specific choices, for crimes against humanity. The principle established at Nuremberg, that following orders does not excuse the commission of atrocities. That participation in a regime of terror is not shielded by the authority of the state, became the foundation of international criminal law as we know it today. It was imperfect. It was victor's justice, some argued then and argue now. It was a tribunal convened by the winning powers of a devastating war to judge the losing ones. These criticisms have merit, and they do not change what Hans Frank did. He administered a territory in which millions of people were starved, enslaved, shot, and gassed. He signed the orders, he attended the meetings, he wrote it all down, he handed the diary over himself. The Nuremberg trials could not bring back the dead. They could not undo the destruction of Poland's Jewish community, which had been one of the richest, most vibrant, most culturally productive communities in all of Europe, and which was reduced by the Holocaust to a fraction of its former existence. They could not return the stolen property, the looted artworks, the confiscated farmlands. But they could establish for the first time in history that there would be a reckoning, that the powerful were not beyond reach, that the machinery of a state could not launder the crimes of individuals into impunity. Hans Frank walked into a gymnasium in Nuremberg at 2:09 a.m. on October 16, 1946, smiling, carrying his Catholic faith like a shield, asking God for mercy. The question of whether God granted it is, of course, not one historians can answer. The question of whether history has judged him correctly is easier. If this video gave you something to think about, if the history of the Nuremberg trials and the men who stood in the dock matters to you, then take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. We cover exactly these kinds of stories, the turning points, the trials, the forgotten details that the textbooks skip over. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Hans Frank's apparent remorse was genuine, or was it the performance of a man who never stopped being a lawyer? I want to read what you think. And if you want to go deeper, check out our video on the full Nuremberg trials, what happened in that courtroom, who walked free, and why the verdicts still spark debate 80 years later. History is not comfortable, but it matters and we'll keep telling it. See you in the next one.